live in a world bound by rules. Objects are solid, time travels forwards, and gravity keeps us firmly fixed to the ground. But sometimes things happen to make us question the world we inhabit.
That's what it sounded like.
I think back and I think it's crazy stuff.
This grey object appeared and then slowly started to move round to the side.
Over the years, eyewitnesses from around the globe have described encounters with creatures normally confined to horror movies. Ghosts, zombies, werewolves. In the modern age, this seems laughable. Yet there's mounting evidence that behind these sightings and apparent myths lies strange yet credible explanations. One of the most enduring myths is the legend of the werewolf. Half man, half wolf, a killer.
When we leave the theater, or when we finish reading a novel about werewolves, we breathe a sigh of relief and say, they don't exist. But they do exist, and did exist. In 16th and 17th century Europe, there were actual werewolves. The stories are so chilling that one hesitates to read about them. This is the story of one of the most notorious werewolves in Europe in the 16th century. His name was Stub Peter. He lived in Bedburg, Cologne, and for 25 years, he reveled in his crimes. He murdered, he raped. Another pleasure that he received was in killing young women and taking out the heart while it was still hot and pulsing and drinking the blood. He was apprehended by a group of hunters. He was brought to trial and without torture confessed. The judge decided that the fit punishment for him was to put him on a wheel and have his executioners take red-hot pincers and tear off his flesh, and then his head was cut off. He was placed in a fire. His ashes were thrown to the wind. It was a powerful reminder to the community of what happens to a werewolf.
In the 16th century, there were dozens of werewolf trials. But the French city of Bordeaux, once the site of such a trial in 1603, was also the setting for a much more recent case. In 1989, a terrible sequence of events brought the werewolf myth out of the history books and onto these streets. A 28-year-old man invited a stranger into his home to share a meal with him. Suddenly, the young man launched a vicious and unprovoked attack on his guest, beating him to death with his bare hands. The killer was quickly caught and jailed. It seemed like an ordinary act of random violence. It was only when he was seen by prison psychiatrist Michel Benezek that the full chilling story emerged.
I got to know this man when he first arrived in prison. And when I began to interview him, it became clear that he was not like a normal prisoner. When I interviewed him, I was surprised because it was the first time I had in front of me someone who described the symptoms of transformation into a werewolf. He said to me, I feel that my teeth are growing longer, and I have the feeling that my skin is not my own, but that of a wolf or a werewolf. I become bad, and I want to bite. I want to drink blood. I want to eat flesh. When he told me about his violent crimes, when he described them in detail, he never expressed the least bit of remorse. On the contrary, he was positively jubilant. After observing him for a few months and running many different tests, I diagnosed him with lycanthropy.
Lycanthropy is a medical term used to describe patients that psychiatrists and doctors see. And the patients appear to be suffering from a psychotic delusion where they believe that they have become transformed into wolves. And this is a genuine belief. These patients are not pretending to have become werewolves.
So what could cause someone to believe they've turned into an animal? Psychiatrist Hamdy Moseley has seen 4 people with lycanthropy. He found one case particularly intriguing.
One of the interesting cases I've seen was a lady who came very embarrassed, very frightened to tell me about the symptoms.
The woman was convinced her hands were turning into claws.
She was frightened about this feeling, and when I asked her why, she said that because I'm going to be crazy or mad, because I'm going to change into animal.
So what was going on? There are certain areas of the brain that correspond directly to different parts of the body. When Dr. Moseley scanned this woman's brain, he found damage, a lesion, in one significant area.
The interesting about this lady was that the lesion was limited to the area of hands and feet where she complained of her symptoms.
Dr. Moseley concluded that it was damage to this woman's brain that made her feel she was turning into an animal. Her brain was telling her it was true. But this was just one case. There are other possible explanations for lycanthropy.
One theory is that these people are suffering from a major mental illness like manic depression or schizophrenia, which can cause a psychotic delusional state. Manic depression seems to be one of the most common diagnoses given to people who might be suffering from lycanthropy. An absolutely key point about lycanthropy is that people who are suffering from this delusion today, when they receive treatment, the vast majority of them get better. And this raises the intriguing question about what would have happened in the Middle Ages when these people were being burned at the stake. If it had been treated in a medical way, like we do today, then those people would have had a very different fate.
But what was the fate of the killer from Bordeaux, convicted of manslaughter?
This man refused treatment of any kind, so it wasn't possible to treat him appropriately. He has now been released and he's free in the community. And I believe there is a chance he'll do it again.
So the man who believes he is a werewolf is still out there, a disquieting thought. But while mental illness or brain injury might explain how a human can believe they've turned into an animal, It does not explain how they could look like one. Yet claims of sightings of strange creatures, half beast, half man, come from all over the world. The most recent took place this year in Delhi.
I was lying like this, and there was a hole in the wall. I could see a face. It was a face like a monkey, but it had eyes like a cat. It was coming at me like this.
Dozens of people reported similar terrifying attacks.
There was a noise and people were shouting. I opened my eyes and saw a black figure about 6 feet tall. I shouted, and the figure jumped 20 feet in the air. It had hair all over its body. My wife shouted, "The monkey's hair, the monkey's hair." And it scratched me on my face. And I saw it was true, as there was blood running down the side of her face. Monkey or man, I couldn't tell. But I could smell sweat from his body.
Nobody was going out in the street in the night. And some people who were sleeping outside, sometime in the night somebody will simply get up and say that Bandar, Bandar means a monkey, Bandar aaya hai means a monkey has come. Then there is panic, stampede, people running, falling down. It was like a complete panic everywhere. And people were afraid. And we could see the fear, we can touch the fear on their face.
3 people died in the mad rush to escape attack. The crime rate fell dramatically as people stayed off the streets. Bizarre descriptions appeared in the press, and the police collected hundreds of eyewitness accounts.
We had to go in very good strength in the areas affected. We had to patrol the area day and night, continuously.
3,000 police officers were sent out onto the dark and deserted streets. It seemed an extreme reaction, but no one really knew what was causing the panic. Could it have been the most obvious thing? A rogue monkey attacking people? There are monkeys living wild on the streets of Delhi. They're very bold and notoriously mischievous.
They'll enter into the houses, they'll open the fridge, they'll take out foodstuff to eat, they will open the tap, they will drink water.
But would these monkeys attack in the way described by eyewitnesses?
Monkeys know where to draw a line. They will never attack without any provocation from human side. So they will not just come and start biting. The rhesus monkey does not behave the way the monkey man was behaving. Rhesus monkeys are not Superman. I'm 100% sure monkey man was not a monkey at all. Any monkey.
If it wasn't a monkey, then what was it? Could a human have been mistaken for a wild animal? Well, perhaps if it was a human that had been living like an animal. These are feral children, children said to have been raised in the wild by animals. These are the so-called wolf girls of India. In the 1920s, they were found in a wolf's lair by an Indian missionary, the Reverend Singh. Despite his attempts to change their behavior, they ran around on all fours and killed birds with their bare teeth. Professor Douglas Candland is a primatologist. He studies monkeys. He has also made a lifetime study of feral children.
The feral child is a beautiful crossover between primate and human. Since 1700, there are at least 400 cases on which we have written records about children who were presumed to have been raised both in the wild and by animals. One of the striking characteristics that human beings always report about feral children is that they are hairy, fully haired, all the way except always the buttocks. This story is so consistent that there has to be an explanation.
Many stories of feral children come from historical accounts and are difficult to verify. When Professor Candland heard about a case in Uganda, he packed a bag and went. The story he heard was of a boy found living with monkeys in the forest. The story had actually begun 10 years earlier. Millie Saber was collecting firewood when she saw a group of monkeys. With the monkeys was a peculiar creature, unlike any she had ever seen before.
It was some kind of monkey, but it looked like a person. It looked half monkey, half human. All the monkeys were trying to scare us away from the creature. They were trying to protect it. I grabbed a stick and I poked him and he fell out of the tree. I had often heard the old stories about monkeys giving birth to creatures that were half monkey, half human. I never believed it, but now I thought, oh my God, those stories must be true. You know, I even looked to see if it had a tail.
The boy they found in the trees that day was just 5 years old. Villagers washed and shaved the boy, and he was cared for by local people. John Sabunya is now a teenager, but he claims he can still remember everything that happened in the forest.
My mom and dad used to fight all the time, and in the end, he killed her. I saw him do it, and I ran to the forest. I was too scared to go on, in case my dad got me and killed me. I stayed in the middle of the forest. It was really frightening. But then I saw these monkeys. They came over to me and gave me bananas and cassava roots.
John, who was only 5 at the time, has no idea how long he spent with the monkeys before he was rescued.
Millie, may I ask you a question? How long was the hair on his head when you first saw him?
He had hair all over his body, thick hair. It was a funny gray color. The hair on his head was so long and curly and all knotted. He was covered in scabs and wounds. Here are the scars. The hair on his body was everywhere, except on his buttocks.
There wasn't hair on the buttocks.
Professor Candland was very impressed by John's deep knowledge of monkeys, but he couldn't explain the hairiness that witnesses had described.
I'm not a specialist in dermatology or in hirsuteness, but I can't see any reason why the so-called feral child would be particularly hairy.
The answer may lie in what John ate, or rather didn't eat while in the forest. Professor Hubert Lacey is an expert on eating disorders.
Well, there are many reasons why someone might become more hairy. I mean, some people are born with a lot of hair. Sometimes that goes quite quickly. Sometimes it remains. Sometimes following cancers and maybe certain hormonal conditions. But one particular one is when there's significant starvation. In anorexia nervosa, patients with, who develop a low body weight, they will develop a very fine downy hair called lanugo hair, which is over most of the body, particularly over the chest and the face.
So if John was living on scraps of food for weeks on end, is it possible this caused him to grow hair all over his body?
If a child was living rough and if they weren't having sufficient food, then with the weight loss they would probably develop these characteristics.
Starvation doesn't always cause hair growth, but why does it happen at all?
It does appear that there could be an evolutionary advantage to this, because for people who are starving, they lose their body fat, and they could have difficulties in maintaining their temperature. But these tiny hairs can trap air, and the result is it's rather like an extra vest. So it would perhaps have an evolutionary advantage in helping someone who's out in the wild to survive.
Feral children or adults who are exceptionally hairy for whatever reason may help explain reports of creatures half man, half beast. In the case of the so-called monkey man of Delhi, we'll never know because he was never caught. After 2 weeks of terror, the attacks suddenly stopped. Skeptics now say the monkey man never existed. He was perhaps a case of mass hysteria. But can we so easily dismiss something which triggered such terrible fear in the people of Delhi?
There was a sense in which the monkey man existed because he definitely existed in people's imagination and in their minds and in their fears. And oddly enough, that is often a more potent place to exist in terms of creating anxiety than reality.
Witnesses still maintain they saw something and that what they saw was real.
When I think about it, I'm so scared that my hair stands on end. I shiver at the thought.
I'm still so scared that I cannot sleep in the dark. I'm afraid that the monkey man will come back.
The dozens of witnesses who claim to have seen the attacks by the so-called monkey man have consistently stuck to their version of events. But whatever the truth, in the telling and retelling of what happened, the story clearly became embellished. And that's not so surprising, because in a mysterious way, many of us would like to believe in strange phenomena. But what are we to make of those who say they can bring people back from the dead? Is the art of black magic just another illusion or something rather more sinister?
Blue moon phenomenon.
A poison that paralyzes and mimics death is a credible explanation of the zombie myth, because it concludes that the victim hasn't really died. And if they haven't really died, then you don't have to explain how they come to be resurrected. Most of us don't believe that the dead can physically return, but there are many who believe that the dead can communicate with the living. Many ordinary people, for example, claim to have had a supernatural experience, perhaps even to have seen a ghost. And perhaps the most famous of these cases is that of the Enfield poltergeist.
It was obvious from the word go that it was a real case.
Maurice Gross is an investigator of paranormal phenomena.
Even now, 25 years later, I think back and I think it's crazy stuff.
In September 1977, he was called to this house in Enfield, North London. It was the home of a mother and her 4 children.
We just sat there looking at one another. We didn't know what to do. We were so scared.
The chair came off the floor and I saw it slide off to the right, about 3.5 to 4 feet before it came to rest.
The family and other eyewitnesses claimed that furniture was moving as though pushed by an invisible force.
I'm invisible.
Objects were flying through the air, and there were strange sounds coming from the walls. Desperate for an explanation, they turned to the Psychical Society. For first-time investigator Maurice Gross, this was uncharted territory.
One has to be very careful, of course, that you're not brought in on a fraudulent type case. Somebody's having a joke. For all I know, it might have been just kids playing around or anything. I didn't know. I had no preconceptions at all.
Maurice rigged tape recorders in different rooms to capture events as they happened. He didn't have to wait long. Bizarre events had become a daily occurrence.
Listen very closely, and you'll hear Janet being pulled out of bed.
Janet was thrown right out of the room onto the stairs.
Maurice was soon convinced he was dealing with a poltergeist. Chris French is a psychologist specializing in anomalous human behavior.
Traditionally, the word poltergeist means noisy spirit, and traditionally people have assumed that there is some kind of spirit involved. Modern parapsychologists often have a slightly different approach. They feel that what the disturbances are caused by is externalized energy coming often from a troubled adolescent.
Recent divorce had disrupted the family, and it was certainly true that 11-year-old Janet was becoming the center of reported activity. A remote stills camera was set up in Janet's bedroom to capture everything that happened. Maurice was utterly convinced by the evidence it was to provide.
The pictures to me suggest that she's being levitated vertically.
Skeptics suggested that Janet might simply be jumping. But photographer Graham Morris, who rigged the camera, said it was operating at such a fast shutter speed that it couldn't be a hoax.
She started off flat in bed, normally. The next shot, the covers had come away. Her arms were flat by her side. There is no picture of her between flat and coming out of the bed. She's gone from that to that. She's literally flying in a sixth of a second.
Morris now felt that he had important evidence to support the presence of a poltergeist, but he was even more convinced when the poltergeist found a voice.
This recording you're going to hear now is the first time it spoke. I spoke to you when I challenged it to speak.
Let me hear you say my name. Come on. Let me hear you say my name. Come on, my name's Morris. Let me hear you say it. Morris.
And that voice was coming out of the mouth of 11-year-old Janet.
So, what you're saying is we couldn't get rid of you by praying to God.
Does that sound like a child's voice? Just judge for yourself.
Dozens of other witnesses heard Janet speak in this voice.
Father, let you protect me from you killing me.
From what the voice told him, Morris came to believe that the spirit of a dead man called Bill was speaking through Janet. And Morris later discovered that Bill was a real person who had lived and died in the house.
And not fell asleep, and I died in a chair in the corner downstairs.
We didn't know that at the time. As far as I know, nobody knew about it. It was only on our later research we found out that's exactly how he died.
The newspapers that picked up the story seemed convinced that Janet had indeed been possessed.
I'm invisible.
Skeptics were not so sure.
Now, I mean, there's no dispute at all from anyone that with respect to where this deep, gravelly voice is coming from, it's coming from Janet. Those who would argue that we're actually hearing a spirit voice would say that a child of that age couldn't maintain this kind of deep, guttural voice for a long period without doing serious damage to the vocal cords. I'd say we don't know what the effects would be, and certainly Janet's uncle did actually claim that she trained herself to speak in this voice.
So was the whole thing just a hoax? And if it was, how could so many eyewitnesses, and Morris himself, who spent 18 months investigating the case, have been fooled?
I think we'd all like to believe in life after death. I mean, it's a very comforting notion. And so any particular case which seems to supply evidence suggesting that we do survive bodily death is something that we're going to want to be true. It might be worth mentioning that Maurice Grosse himself had actually lost a young daughter tragically a couple of years before this investigation began. And on top of that, you've got a man who had dedicated his life to psychical research and desperately wanted to find a case like this.
The family don't want to discuss what happened, but at the time they did sign written statements declaring that they were telling the truth about events that took place in their home.
Out there, people can make up their own minds what it's all about. What I have done, and what we have done, is present the evidence, and we believe that speaks for itself. No matter what these armchair critics say, this evidence speaks for itself.
So it all depends which side of the fence you're on. Either you accept Morris's interpretation of events, or you think he and the other witnesses were hoax. But it is not always quite that black and white. The world's largest ghost hunt, which took place in Scotland earlier this year, revealed that there is sometimes more to ghosts than simple trickery. A lone piper is said to walk the battlements of Edinburgh Castle, and its dungeons are said to be haunted by the ghosts of French soldiers imprisoned there in the 18th century. In fact, Edinburgh is reputed to be the most haunted city in Europe. It's here that Dr. Richard Wiseman and a team of researchers set up a ghost hunt using a battery of high-tech equipment and over 240 volunteers. They sought out the place described as the most haunted in Edinburgh, the vaults which lie under the South Bridge. Fran Hollingrake is an expert on the city's ghosts.
Okay, just to reiterate, ladies and gentlemen, please be careful of the stairs because they are very worn. Follow me.
5 years giving guided tours here has convinced her that the vaults deserve their reputation.
Hardly a week has gone by without somebody having something strange happen to them. Generally, it's the customers who come on the tours that have the experiences, but on several occasions I myself have experienced strange phenomena.
These chambers have only recently been reopened after being walled up for years. Since then, there have been reported sightings of 8 different spirits, including that of an angry man wielding a knife and a mischievous little boy.
There was one particular room that I was standing in, and I was wearing a long black cloak, and I was holding a candle in my hands, and suddenly there was this sort of sharp tug, and my candle in my hands moved very sharply. And being the professional I am, I sort of carried on talking, and it happened again, this sort of sharp tug, And I remember thinking, go away, little boy, I'm busy. You know, I'm like you do to a 5-year-old, you know, look, go, stop bothering me. And it didn't happen again, and I was quite shaken by it, but I sort of carried on, and it wasn't until I finished that actually the full force of it sort of hit me, and I started to get quite, you know, anxious about it.
So were Fran and other witnesses experiencing something real? Dr. Wiseman wanted to find out if his volunteers would experience similar sensations.
First of all, we've no idea what you're going to experience. We're not going to pull any tricks on you at all. This isn't one of these things where someone's going to jump out on you. But you have my word, take my word.
To understand what was going on, he needed his volunteers to spend time in the vaults under controlled conditions.
So we're going to be placing you into one of the vaults on your own, okay? And we just want you to relax and see if you experience anything unusual.
The volunteers were left alone in 10 separate chambers, all rigged with monitoring equipment. Some of the rooms had a reputation for being haunted, while others did not. But neither Dr. Wiseman nor his volunteers knew which was which. The volunteers were left alone to record everything that happened.
Well, it's the end of the day, and it's been quite an exciting one. Around about 40% of people have reported some sort of experience.
Coldness on the ankle, and it was like something brushed it, and that's when I was sort of squeal. Very brave.
After a few minutes, I felt a really hot burning itch on the inside of my left arm, and it got hotter and itchier.
A person here feeling that there was somebody actually standing behind them.
You hear what sounds like somebody who's breathing. That's quite terrifying.
Another person reporting there actually has a sensation of being watched. One person has actually seen a figure of a man with a leather apron.
Okay, there's just no way I'd come down here on my own again. I would have to be in a party or a group, but I wouldn't be left alone on here.
When Dr. Wiseman analyzed the data, he discovered something very interesting. The people who had experienced ghostly phenomena were those who had been in the haunted vaults. But was this proof that there were spirits present? Dr. Wiseman's equipment offered other possible explanations.
What we discovered is the haunted vaults have more sense of air movement in there than the control vaults. So maybe people are walking in, feeling a draft, and that's the unusual experience. Now, we also found out that the haunted vaults have a rather unusual variation in their magnetic fields. And so, and this is a controversial theory, but it's still a possibility that people are walking in and those fields are having a rather unusual effect on their bodies and maybe their brains, and that accounts for the experiences that they're having there.
Could magnetic fields really make us feel a ghostly presence? Dr. Michael Persinger thinks they can. In a specially built chamber, he can induce supernatural experiences by using electromagnetic fields.
If we apply the fields in a specific sequence, we can induce the experience of a sensed presence, that there are some entity standing beside the person.
Dr. Persinger has found that he can recreate these experiences by exposing volunteers' brains to intense magnetic fields. This volunteer is wearing a special helmet, rigged to stimulate her brain. Under its influence, she starts to experience something which sounds chillingly familiar.
It's as though something's got hold of my left leg and
something's pulling me, but I can't see what it is doing it. I'm frightened. This is odd. I don't know what I'm frightened about. I feel really scared.
The sensations this woman described under the influence of a magnetic field are very similar to those experienced by the volunteers in the vaults in Edinburgh.
I felt a very sharp tug on my cloak, and it happened twice. And I have no idea. I thought I'd trodden on my cloak or caught it on a nail, but there was absolutely nothing there.
There was definitely a feeling over there of something going past.
Although the magnetic fields in the vaults in Edinburgh were not as strong as those used by Dr. Persinger, they may still help to explain what the volunteers experienced. But there are other invisible forces that can cause us to see ghosts. Strange things had been happening at scientist Vic Tandy's laboratory in Warwick. The cleaning lady said she'd seen a ghost, and other colleagues reported a strange sense of presence in the room. But Vic was dubious, until one night he was alone in the lab.
While I was working, I began to feel as if there was somebody watching me. You know, this feeling that there's somebody sort of, you know, staring at you. So I looked around, there's nobody there. I started to feel the hairs standing up on the back of my neck. I started to feel as if there was a chill. I started to perspire. And slowly, I noticed almost moving shadows by my shoulders, as if there was something moving behind me. And then this sort of grey object appeared. First of all, just very much in my peripheral vision, and then slowly started to move round to the side. As you can imagine, that was a bit worrying. I thought, well, you know, there's nothing else I can do really. I've got to turn and look at this thing. And so as I turned to kind of face it just disappeared. Just as if, you know, like smoke, just poof, gone.
The next day, Vic was making some adjustments to a thin metal blade when it began to vibrate, apparently of its own accord.
After the night before, you know, I thought, oh, this is too much. So the hackles went up, all the, you know, the same effects from the night before. But eventually I thought, no, you know, this is getting some energy from somewhere.
But what invisible force could make an object move in this way? Vic suspected it could be a sound wave. Some quick detective work told him there was a sound wave present that was vibrating at a frequency of 19 hertz. From there, Vic was able to track down the source, an industrial fan, recently installed in the laboratory.
We turned the fan off, the foil blade stopped moving, and the room was a different place. It was almost as though somebody sort of like thrown open the doors, and it was much less oppressive.
The sound waves which Vic had detected are known as infrasound. They are at a frequency too low for the human ear to detect, but they can affect the eye, making it vibrate.
So the movement would smear something in your peripheral vision, which is very similar to the kind of effect that I experienced. It could also cause you to hyperventilate, and hyperventilation can cause you to feel panic.
Vic was convinced that infrasound produced by the fan had caused him to see the grey figure, and heightened his feelings of fear. And if this was the case, could it explain other sightings of ghosts? In a 14th century cellar with a haunted reputation, he went in search of low-frequency sound waves.
There was a reading there that showed us that there was the presence of infrasound, and that it was peaking at the door, which is where these effects are reported. I think that actually a significant proportion of the sort of ghosts, where there's a grey object, where there's this feeling of presence, can be explained by infrasound.
In this case, Vic couldn't be sure what was generating the infrasound, and he is keen to take his research further. But can infrasound and magnetic fields explain everything that the volunteers taking part in the Edinburgh ghost hunt experienced? Emma Beebe was left alone in the chamber with the most haunted reputation of all. And it's something she will never forget.
I suddenly heard something in the room with me, a noise, and I couldn't tell you what it was. I thought it was part of the experiment. I thought it was some sort of elaborate setup or trick or something to make me more frightened.
I can hear what sounds like somebody else breathing. That's quite terrifying. Pretty anxious here.
That's what it sounded like, which is not the kind of breathing you want to hear, whether there's a real person or not.
Okay, I can definitely hear somebody here.
As I started to talk about it, it seemed to restrain itself. It tried to make itself quieter. It felt like an interaction. It's very hard to resolve it. I can't explain it. I can't explain it to other people. I can't explain it to myself. And I'm in two minds about it still. I can either think there was something in that room with me, and if there was something in that room with me, then I don't know what to believe anymore.
It's easy to dismiss people who report bizarre experiences as unreliable, hysterical, deluded. But perhaps we can find a place for apparently supernatural events in our world. We've seen how fear of ghosts can be generated by natural phenomena. Our belief in werewolves can be triggered by a rare mental illness, and how zombies could be the product of simple but effective poisoning. All these explanations may in time prove wrong. Some of them, after all, seem a little improbable. But as the great detective Sherlock Holmes once said, once you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.